Wade Wilson lights a cigarette on a pile of his own corpses and tells you, without blinking, that he's about to die. Again, that's the tone setter. A superhero sequel that opens not on a city in danger, but on a man who's decided his life isn't worth living, and still somehow finds a way to turn that into a punchline. Right away, Deadpool 2 lets you know this isn't just more snark and severed limbs. It's a story about a guy who has literally everything except a reason to stay alive, and that absence is about to drive the entire movie. A few minutes earlier in his timeline, Wade is on top of the world in the most mundane way possible. He's still slicing and shooting his way through international bad guys, but the important part is that he has a home to come back to and a future he actually believes in. Wade and Vanessa aren't just bantering. They're talking about starting a family, about what it looks like to turn this chaos into something stable, and the film plays those scenes as genuinely warm instead of winking at you every second. For a franchise built on fourth-wall jokes and ultra-violence, that domestic stretch is surprisingly quiet and sincere. And that's exactly why what happens next hits so hard. The hit that changes everything doesn't come in a slow-burn tragedy. It crashes straight through Wade's front door. The killers aren't cosmic threats or color-coded CGI armies, just the messy fallout from his mercenary life catching up to him. And in the scramble to protect Vanessa, Deadpool does almost everything right. Almost. One bullet slips through. The camera and the sound design both tighten around that moment, and Vanessa is gone before Wade or the audience has time to process anything except impact. It's fast, brutal, and framed like a classic superhero. Origin of pain. Beat. But there's an extra cruelty in how ordinary the violence feels, how little warning anyone gets. From there, the movie leans all the way into Wade's collapse. His first response isn't noble rage or stoic determination, it's self-destruction, over and over, with the same kind of wry-rated creativity he once reserved for other people. That choice matters, because it tells you this isn't a story about a hero who rises cleanly from tragedy. It's about someone who can't see any path forward at all and starts treating death like a punchline he can finally control. Even when the film cuts to slower, more stylized moments, Wade drifting through water toward Vanessa in a glowing afterlife version of their apartment, it keeps that tension between visual beauty and emotional numbness, between the joke and the wound that joke is covering. And yet, the world around him doesn't pause to let him grieve in peace. This is still a loud, messy superhero universe filled with metal-skinned X-Men, time-traveling soldiers, and a kid whose anger could literally burn the future down. As Deadpool 2 pulls back from that intimate tragedy into its larger world, what you see isn't just a playground for action scenes. You see a kind of emotional junkyard, a place where almost everyone is lugging around some version of Wade's pain, but dealing with it in wildly different ways. Cable shows up from that future like grief-given muscles and a rifle, a man so consumed by what he's lost that his entire existence has narrowed down to one mission. Russell, this angry teenager with fire in his hands, is stuck in the present tense of trauma, bouncing between lashing out and desperately wanting someone, anyone, to treat him like more than a weapon or a problem. Even the more comedic figures, like Colossus trying to be the patient, old-school hero mentor, or Domino breezing through danger on sheer luck, feel like pieces of a larger conversation about how you survive in a world that keeps giving you new reasons to shut down. What makes this world introduction so striking is that it never stops being ridiculous while it's doing all of this. The same movie that shows Wade cradling Vanessa in his arms will later throw a parachute squad out of a plane just to kill them in increasingly absurd ways, and it expects you to laugh without forgetting what kicked this whole story off. The tone doesn't smooth out, it collides. That clash between the sincere and the stupid, the tragic and the flippant, isn't a bug in Deadpool 2's design. It's the whole point of how this universe operates. So when Wade calls this a family film in his own twisted way, he's not just trolling the audience. The movie's world is built on people who've lost something essential and are trying to replace it with whatever they can grab. A mission, a team, a kid to protect, a cause to burn the world down for. The jokes, the meta-commentary, the blood-splattered set pieces, they're all wrapped around one uncomfortable question. The opening lays on the table and refuses to take back, if you can't die, and the person you wanted to live for is gone. What's left to pull you back from the edge? There's a specific kind of misery that looks like a joke from the outside. You know the type. The person who won't stop making you laugh, who keeps the energy loud and the sarcasm sharp, and the whole time you're watching them, you're half aware that none of it is connecting to anything underneath. That's Wade Wilson in the weeks after Vanessa's death. Not mourning, performing, and performing badly, for an audience of one. The film doesn't drag out that collapse into a slow, dignified character study. It throws it at you in pieces. A montage of destroyed apartments, chemical burns that heal instantly, explosions, He walks out of looking vaguely disappointed. Each attempt is photographed with a certain sick comedy, the kind that makes you flinch and then feel guilty for laughing. And the point isn't the gore or the spectacle, the point is the repetition. Wade keeps coming back. The body won't cooperate. The healing factor that made him a nearly unkillable mercenary has become a cruel joke of its own. The one thing he can't escape is himself. That dynamic is doing real narrative work. The film is setting up a character whose central weapon is also his central prison. Most superhero origin stories treat the powers as the solution. Here's what you can do now. Here's how you save the day. Deadpool 2 inverts it. The regeneration that makes Wade almost impossible to kill is exactly what he resents. He can't choose to stop. He can't make any kind of permanent decision about his own existence. He's stuck. And the movie makes sure you feel the suffocating absurdity of that before it gives him anything to move toward. Colossus and the kindness. Nobody asked for. Enter Colossus. Patient, enormous, inexhaustibly optimistic in that very specific way that only cartoon-level good guys can sustain. He shows up not as a plot delivery mechanism, but as a persistent belief that Wade Wilson is redeemable and just needs a direction, which Wade finds equal parts annoying and, buried under all the deflection, vaguely touching. The X-Men recruitment pitch isn't a triumphant montage. It's closer to dragging a hungover friend off the couch and forcing them to come to something they swore they'd never attend. What's smart about this stretch is how clearly the film understands the difference between Wade wanting to be better and Wade being willing to do the work. He shows up at the X-Men's doorstep, but he shows up in pieces, half-dressed, emotionally erratic, entirely uncommitted. Colossus offers structure. Wade offers chaos. The friction between them isn't played for broad buddy comedy laughs, as much as it's played for something quieter, a man who has run out of reasons trying on somebody else's reasons to see if any of them fit. They mostly don't, but the trying matters. The X-Men's mansion itself, with its empty hallways and training grounds and elaborate ethical infrastructure, functions almost like a mirror image of the life Wade and Vanessa were reaching toward. Organized, purposeful, grounded in something larger than individual survival. The film doesn't belabor the comparison. It doesn't need to. You just feel the contrast between the way Wade moves through those spaces, loose and indifferent, and the way everyone else inhabits them with conviction. Essex house and the angry kid with fire in his hands. The story doesn't let Wade sit in that limbo for long before tossing him a problem he genuinely can't deflect his way out of. The call about the Essex house for mutant rehabilitation, the orphanage, which is a word that already carries everything you need to know about its relationship to warmth and safety, gets framed as a standard training mission. Trainee Deadpool rides shotgun with Colossus and Negasonic teenage warhead. Routine stuff. Russell Collins is not routine stuff. He's 16, maybe, and furious in the way that only people who've been systematically hurt by people they were supposed to trust can be furious, with zero distance between the pain and the reaction, no filter at all, just the raw thing right there on the surface, blazing hot. When you meet him outside Essex house screaming about what the staff does to the kids there, the comedy of the situation, Deadpool trying to manage a volatile teenager while Colossus lectures about restraint from across the parking lot, keeps the energy moving, but the substance underneath is genuinely ugly. The Essex orphanage isn't just a plot location. It's an institution built on punishing mutant children for having powers, run by people who call themselves rehabilitators and behave like sadists, and Russell has been in the middle of that his entire life. The film doesn't linger on the abuse in graphic detail because it doesn't have to. Russell's anger explains everything. The way he oscillates between screaming threats and looking like a kid who desperately needs someone to tell him he's worth something. Those two things coexist in his face constantly, and it's one of Julian Dennison's finest choices in the performance that you can see both states simultaneously rather than just one at a time. Wade, for all his chaos, locks onto that. Not immediately, not cleanly. He makes everything worse at least twice before anything improves, but there's a flicker of recognition. He knows something about existing in a body that works against you, about the gap between the version of yourself people want to neutralize and the version that actually needs help. That recognition gets buried under bad decisions and worse timing, but it plants the seed the entire second and third act will grow from. The icebox, powerless and stuck. The botched Essex house incident lands both Wade and Russell in the icebox, a maximum security mutant prison where the cells come equipped with inhibitor collars that cut off powers completely. For Wade, this means no healing factor. For the first time in years, he's genuinely, mortally vulnerable to everything. The prison set design earns its keep here. It's brutalist and gray, and completely stripped of the color and motion that usually follow Wade everywhere he goes. The collar is a physical object that does exactly what the grief has been doing emotionally. It shuts down the one thing he relies on to keep himself from being destroyed. He can't regenerate his way out of a wound. He can't survive something that would normally be survivable. The collar makes his mortality literal, and the film uses that very deliberately. Now the stakes of getting hurt are real, in a way they haven't been since before the cancer, before the experiment, before he became whatever Deadpool is. It's also in the icebox where the dynamic between Wade and Russell starts to crystallize into something resembling care. Russell is trying to survive through aggression, intimidating other prisoners, performing toughness, doing what you do when you've learned that vulnerability gets exploited. Wade sees through all of it, mostly because he spent years doing the exact same thing in the exact same register. He doesn't try to fix Russell. He doesn't lecture him. Mostly he just stays in his orbit and occasionally says something cutting that's secretly kind, which is his only working mode for emotional connection. The prison sequences also function as the film's most stripped-down storytelling. No meta-jokes, no elaborate action staging, just character and consequence. The color palette cools down almost completely. Conversations happen in cramped, low-ceiling spaces rather than open playgrounds. There's a weight to it that the film earns by establishing so much motion everywhere else. You notice the stillness because it's unusual. Cable arrives and changes the math, and then everything shifts. Josh Brolin's Cable doesn't enter the story gently. He crashes into the near future, then into the present, with the kinetic bluntness of a man who's decided that the cleanest solution to a complicated problem is to arrive heavily armed and eliminate the variables. His design does a lot of narrative work before he says a single word. The mechanical arm, the tactical gear that's practical and battered rather than sleek, the way he moves like someone carrying a weight beyond the physical. He looks like grief made functional, which is exactly what he is. What the film does cleverly is hold his full motivation back for a beat. You know he's from the future. You know he's after Russell. What you don't immediately know is why, and the film lets you sit with Cable as a threat long enough to develop genuine menace before it starts layering in the complexity. When you finally understand that his daughter and wife are dead in his timeline, burned in the wreckage of something Russell eventually becomes, the mission reframes completely. He's not a villain doing evil guy things. He's a father who watched his family die and then got in a time machine, and his single-minded ruthlessness starts to look like the mirror image of Wade's self-destruction. Two people, two responses to unbearable loss, both of them functionally destructive. That parallel is the quiet engine of Act 1. Cable wants to eliminate Russell. Wade wants to save him. Both of them are, in their own cracked ways, trying to prevent a future that already devastated them. Cable literally, Wade in the sense that he sees in Russell the trajectory of someone who might never get the intervention he needed himself. The superhero movie conflict of hero versus I, Big Bad, is actually two grieving people with different strategies for handling the same impossible pain. The Convoy, when action becomes argument. The truck convoy sequence, where Cable attacks the prisoner transport to get to Russell and Deadpool, improvises an entire opposing mission in real time, is the moment Act 1 snaps into full operational mode. It's also where the film makes the clearest argument that action in Deadpool 2 isn't decorative. It's argumentative. David Leitch's background shapes how that sequence reads. He made his bones choreographing fights where movement reveals character, where you understand who someone is, by how they move through space, what they protect, what they don't bother defending. The Convoy works the same way. Cable moves like a man with a precision surgical objective. Every obstacle is just something between him and the target. Wade moves like organized chaos, improvising wildly around an emotional commitment. He doesn't have a real plan. He has a reason, and that reason is the kid in the transport. The different fighting styles aren't just visually distinct. They're a physical conversation about intention. Brolin and Reynolds haven't even built chemistry yet in this sequence, which is part of what makes it interesting. They're not fighting each other the way rivals do. They're moving around each other, the way two people in the same argument do when neither has bothered to actually hear the other. Cable's attempts to get past Deadpool feel less like superhero combat and more like someone trying to finish a sentence while another person keeps interrupting. Which, if you think about what they're actually arguing, Russell's future, and what it justifies, is exactly right. The sequence also introduces Domino as a full character rather than just an action piece. Her luck powers, rendered as a kind of slow-motion ballet of things going improbably right, are both funny and philosophically interesting in a way that mirrors her function in the story. She's the argument that the universe isn't entirely indifferent, that sometimes things just work out. Next to Wade's nihilism and Cable's certainty, she's the option the film suggests neither of them is considering. By the time the convoy sequence ends and the dust settles on the Act 1 board, the film has built something more architecturally interesting than most superhero sequels manage. The emotional geometry is clean. Wade needs a reason to live, Russell needs someone to believe in him before he becomes the thing that destroys Cable's family, and Cable needs to be wrong about how the future is fixed. Those three needs are on a collision course, and the film has been careful to make all three of them feel earned. Wade's suicidal drift wasn't played as quirky background. It was the actual starting state of the protagonist. Russell's anger wasn't written as generic, teen villain energy. It was rooted in specific, recognizable trauma. Cable's mission wasn't framed as evil. It was framed as a rational response to an unbearable personal loss. The film is asking you to hold all of that simultaneously, which is exactly the kind of tonal balancing act that most superhero movies either abandon early or never attempt in the first place. Deadpool 2 is betting that you can laugh at a scene where Wade improvises a Zamboni-based getaway, and then, 10 minutes later, sit quietly with the knowledge that the same guy tried to blow himself up on a pile of gas canisters because he couldn't think of a better option. So far, it's winning that bet. At some point in almost every superhero movie, the protagonist decides that what they really need is a team. Usually this comes with a training montage, maybe a meaningful glance or two, some banter that signals growing trust, and then a triumphant deployment. Deadpool 2 does something much more interesting with that beat. It assembles a team with enormous ceremony and then immediately kills almost all of them in a woodchipper. That's not just shock comedy, though it's absolutely that too. It's a structural argument the film is quietly making about what found family actually means. It's telling you, explicitly and hilariously, that you don't get to choose your family through a job posting. You don't build it with a tryout and a team name. You build it through the specific, unglamorous business of staying when things get catastrophic, and almost nobody, Wade recruits, has any intention of doing that. The X-Force audition scene. The recruitment sequence is, on a pure comedy level, one of the film's best constructed set pieces. Wade sits across from a parade of mutant applicants in a hotel conference room. With the approximate seriousness of someone interviewing candidates for a mid-level marketing position, he's got criteria. He's got a team philosophy, which he delivers with complete conviction while wearing spandex. He's assembled a slideshow. Shatterstar gets in because he's from outer space. Bedlam makes it because his vibes are reasonably solid. Zeitgeist has the acid vomit power that Wade approves of without asking too many follow-up questions. Vanisher is literally invisible, so there's no way to know if he showed up or not. He gets hired on faith. And then there's Peter, regular, round-faced, genuinely enthusiastic Peter, who has no powers whatsoever and simply saw the ad online and thought it sounded interesting. Peter might be the funniest single joke in Deadpool 2, and he's also doing something real. In a film about a guy who builds family out of unconventional material, an entirely powerless man who just decided to show up is a kind of thesis statement delivered with the straightest possible face. Peter shouldn't be there. He has no business being anywhere near this mission. And yet, he's the one Wade most visibly doesn't want dead. Domino, meanwhile, earns her place by being the only applicant who makes Wade genuinely uncomfortable. Not through intimidation, but through competence he can't easily dismiss. Her power is luck. Things go her way. The universe bends slightly in her favor at critical moments. Wade's immediate objection is that luck isn't visually interesting, which is a very specific flavor of wrong, and the film is about to spend a significant amount of time proving exactly how wrong it is. The drop, comedy is consequent. The X-Force deployment via aerial insertion is the sequence the film has been building toward without you realizing it. They exit the plane in formation, parachutes deployed, looking briefly like a real superhero unit doing a real mission in a real movie. And then, the wind takes. Bedlam hits a bus. Zeitgeist lands in a woodchipper. Shatterstar meets a helicopter rotor in a way that even he would probably describe as suboptimal. Vanisher gets electrocuted on a power line, and for one perfect moment as he dies, you see that he's played by Brad Pitt, a cameo so brief and so committed that it almost defines the entire sequence's ethos: maximum investment, minimum survival. Peter lands safely in a field and immediately takes stock of the situation with the calm pragmatism of someone who never expected to survive this long anyway. The comedic timing here is immaculate. Leach stages each death with its own specific rhythm, some fast, some slow, some with sound effects that would be at home in a Looney Tunes short, and the humor works because the film has done just enough to make you care marginally about each of these people. Not deeply, not in a way that requires a real emotional response, but enough to make each death feel like losing a weird friend rather than watching nameless extras get cleared off the board. But here's what the sequence is actually doing. It's stripping away the concept of the team. Wade wanted X-Force. Wade recruited X-Force. And X-Force is now mostly dead, killed not by the villain or by overwhelming odds, but by ordinary wind on a clear afternoon. The elaborate infrastructure he built to protect Russell and give himself purpose has dissolved into a field full of bad landings before it even made contact with the problem it was supposed to solve. What's left is Domino, the woman whose power is simply that things work out, and one extremely willing civilian named Peter. That's the team. That's the family. Not the assembled supergroup Wade imagined, but the version that actually survived, which turns out to be the version that was never part of his plan. Russell's other option. While Wade is watching his carefully assembled operation collapse aerially, Russell is making his own decision about the family question and making it in the opposite direction. Inside the icebox, Russell has been watching, calculating, and feeling everything that's happened to him. The powerlessness of the caller. The isolation of a system that's been brutalizing him for years and calling it help. The specific sting of watching someone he briefly thought might actually care about him. Wade, who stood up for him outside Essex house before everything went sideways, apparently abandoned the mission under pressure. Juggernaut is in the icebox too. The Juggernaut in this film is many things. A practical effects marvel, a legitimately terrifying physical presence, a vehicle for a MCU Easter egg that the movie deploys with perfect comedic timing. But in this specific context, what he is to Russell is a mirror. He's someone who was also locked away and mistreated. Someone the system decided to contain rather than help. Someone whose power comes from the very things that make him uncontrollable, and who has zero interest in being rehabilitated into something safer and smaller. Russell's decision to align himself with Juggernaut isn't naive. It's calculated despair. He's looked at every available option. The X-Men structure, Wade's protection, the orphanage's version of rehabilitation, and concluded that none of them were ever actually about him. They were about what other people needed from him or wanted to prevent in him. Juggernaut, at least, doesn't pretend. He's honest about what he is and what he wants, and in Russell's experience, that's rarer than it should be. It's a genuinely dark pivot for a character the film has spent a lot of time making sympathetic. Russell isn't becoming the villain. He's becoming someone who's decided that if the world keeps treating him like a monster, he might as well start making that threat real. The logic is understandable. The conclusion is catastrophic. Julian Dennison holds both of those things at once throughout the prison sequences, and the specificity of that performance keeps Russell from ever becoming a simple, cautionary tale. Wade gets quiet. There's a version of this movie where Wade's near-death experience, his body taking damage it would ordinarily heal from while the collar is active, the full weight of his mortality landing on him in an environment built to make him helpless, becomes the film's loud, emotional pivot point. The version where he delivers a speech, or has a revelation, or resolves something clearly. Deadpool 2 doesn't do that. Wade gets quiet instead. And quiet is not a word that normally belongs anywhere near this character. When he stops performing, stops with the fourth wall breaks and the pop culture references and the relentless deflection, you feel the absence of it. It's a silence that the film earns precisely because it's been so loud up to this point. Ryan Reynolds sells this almost entirely in body language. The way Wade sits versus the way he usually occupies space. The way his hands don't know what to do. The slight collapse of the posture that usually projects complete chaotic confidence. The near death in the icebox does something narratively crucial. It makes Wade afraid. Not of dying. He spent the early part of this movie actively trying to accomplish that, but of not mattering, of Russell making the choice Russell is about to make and nobody being around who cared enough to prevent it. The collar took away the thing he uses to avoid responsibility. Being mortal, briefly, stripped the joke away. When the collar comes off and the healing kicks back in, it's not triumphant. It's almost reluctant. Wade pulls himself back together, not because he's decided to live, exactly, but because Russell is running out of time, and apparently that's enough of a reason to get up. Domino takes the wheel. The mid-act 2 stretch belongs largely to Domino, and the film uses her effectively as a tonal contrast to everything happening around her. Where Wade is drowning in meaning and Cable is weaponized by it, Domino moves through the world with an almost philosophical ease. Things go her way. She doesn't overthink it. She's made peace with operating on uncertainty, and that piece reads as both a superpower and a personality. Her action sequences in Act 2, particularly the stretches where she's improvising her way through the transport chaos while everyone else is either fighting for their lives or dying hilariously, are the most visually playful in the whole film. Leach photographs her luck sequences differently from everything else. Longer takes, more fluid camera movement, a willingness to let the improbable chain reactions play out at full speed rather than cutting around them. The effect is a kind of kinetic joy that sits in deliberate contrast to the weight in the Wade and Russell storylines. But Domino also functions as a thematic foil in a way that's easy to overlook because she's so charming. In a movie about people trying to control the future, Cable literally arriving from it with a hit list, Wade trying to intervene in Russell's trajectory. Domino is the argument for trusting the process. Her power isn't control, it's readiness. She doesn't make things go her way exactly. She stays prepared enough that when things break in her direction, she can take advantage. The film never belabors this, never makes it a speech, but it's there in how she's written and how Zazie Beetz plays her, a woman who's decided the universe is negotiable if you pay attention. Juggernaut breaks out, and the board clears. When Juggernaut and Russell break free from the icebox, the film's second act accelerates into its operational endgame with the specific momentum of a story that's been holding its breath and finally exhales. The breakout sequence is enormous, literally, because Juggernaut is enormous, and the film commits to that scale throughout in a way that makes most of his scenes feel genuinely threatening rather than comedic. He doesn't move like a man in a suit. He moves like a freight train that's slightly irritated. Every wall he goes through communicates that the containment of the entire system built to hold people like Russell was always provisional, always just a structure built on the assumption that the people inside it wouldn't push back hard enough. When that assumption breaks, it breaks completely. Russell heading for Essex House is the completion of a terrible logic. The place that hurt him is still standing. The people who ran it are still there. And he has Juggernaut at his side, which is roughly the equivalent of bringing a demolition crew to a disagreement you've been having with a building. The plan isn't subtle. The plan is to end the thing that made him into someone who needed to end things. Cable's timeline activates here. This is the event, or close enough to it, that leads to the version of the future he arrived from. The scene he's been racing to prevent is unfolding, and the film has done enough work with him by this point that you understand his urgency as parental desperation rather than mechanical villainy. He's watching the moment arrive. Every second is his daughter's life, and Wade is in the middle, without his healing factor fully restored, without a team, without a plan, but with something he didn't start this movie with, a reason. Strip away the action set pieces, the jokes, the beautifully timed cameos, and the Juggernaut reveal. And Act 2 of Deadpool 2 is doing something precise and purposeful. It's showing you every version of how you can respond when the thing that makes you who you are gets taken away. Wade loses Vanessa. Cable loses his family. Russell loses his faith in any system that was supposed to protect him. Domino never lost it because she was paying attention to something different. And the X-Force, assembled to solve all of this through competence and numbers and a decent-looking logo, gets taken out by meteorological conditions before it can do anything at all. The found family that the movie is actually interested in doesn't form through recruitment or strategy. It forms through the specific act of showing up when everything has already gone wrong, when the wind has already taken the parachutists, when the kid is already running toward the worst version of himself, when the only option left is to move toward the problem rather than away from it. Cable, Domino, and Wade aren't a team by Act 2's end. There are three people who've each run out of every other option and happen to be in the same crisis at the same time, which, as it turns out, is what a family usually looks like when you strip the concept back to its bare bones. The Essex house is waiting. Russell is on his way. And the movie is about to ask all three of them, and you, if you're paying attention, exactly what you're willing to sacrifice for someone who hasn't given you a single obvious reason to save them. There's a moment near the end of Deadpool 2 that almost nobody talks about when they're listing the film's highlights. It doesn't have a joke in it. It doesn't have a fight. It's just Wade Wilson lying on the ground, dying in the most literal and final sense of the word, holding a teenager's hand and telling him that his life is worth something. No punchline follows. The music doesn't swell into irony. The scene just sits there, nakedly sincere, inside a movie that opened with a man trying to blow himself up on a gas main. That contrast between where Wade started and where he lands is the whole emotional architecture of Act 3. To understand why that moment works, you have to trace how the film gets there, because it earns that sincerity through approximately 40 minutes of escalating chaos, bad decisions, a fistfight with an unkillable freight train of a man, and at least one sequence involving Deadpool's legs regenerating from the hips down in real time while Negasonic Teenage Warhead looks deeply uncomfortable. Arriving at Essex House. The convoy to Essex House carries a different energy from anything in the first two acts. The jokes don't stop. This is still Deadpool 2, and the meta-commentary never fully powers down, but there's a current of actual urgency running underneath everything that wasn't there before. Wade is in a truck with Cable and Domino, three people who have spent most of the film's runtime either fighting each other or talking past each other, and they're converging on the same location for different reasons that only partially overlap. Cable wants to stop Russell before the kill that starts the chain reaction leading to his family's deaths. Domino wants to help, which is her consistent mode of operation. And Wade wants to prevent Russell from doing something that can't be undone. Not because of Cable's timeline, but because he remembers what it looks like when someone decides they're past saving and starts acting accordingly. That distinction matters. Cable is preventing a future event. Wade is trying to intervene in a present choice. Those are philosophically different interventions, and the film is careful to keep that gap visible throughout Act 3, rather than collapsing it into a single shared mission. Their cooperation is real, but conditional. They're working together because the immediate problem requires it, not because they've resolved what they're each actually trying to accomplish. Juggernaut and the problem with raw power. Juggernaut arrives at Essex House slightly ahead of schedule for anyone hoping to have a calm conversation with Russell, and the film stages his presence there with genuine menace. This is not a comedic obstacle. He tears through the building with a purposefulness that's almost administrative. Walls are in the way, walls cease to exist, and the scale of him relative to everything around him communicates immediately that conventional opposition isn't going to work. Colossus tries anyway. The Colossus versus Juggernaut fight is one of those sequences that functions simultaneously as pure spectacle and as character illumination. Colossus is everything Juggernaut isn't. Patient, principled, restrained, committed to the idea that strength should be used with intention rather than just applied at maximum force to whatever's in front of you. He's also losing this fight decisively for most of its duration, because Juggernaut operates outside the ethical framework Colossus has built his identity around. You can't reason with a structural force. You can only absorb it long enough for something else to change. Negasonic Teenage Warhead and Yukio's eventual contribution to the Juggernaut problem, and the specific, gloriously unglamorous method they ultimately used to stop him, belongs in the film's hall of creative solutions to apparently impossible problems. It's not a power versus power resolution. It's a technical exploitation of a specific vulnerability, executed by two characters who've been largely sidelined and who take down the movie's most physically overwhelming threat with something closer to a utility play than a climactic battle. The film clearly delights in how anticlimactic the actual solution is, and that delight is contagious. Wade gets torn in half. Wade's confrontation with Juggernaut doesn't go the same direction. There's no clever exploitation of a weakness, no neat resolution. Juggernaut grabs him and separates him into two pieces with the casual efficiency of someone tearing a bread roll, and the camera doesn't look away from the specifics of that. The regeneration sequence that follows. Wade's lower half slowly, painfully regrowing from where his torso ends while he props himself against a wall, making progressively worse jokes about what he can and can't feel, is played for comedy, but the comedy has an edge to it. The healing factor that's been his defining physical trait becomes, in this scene, something almost horrifying, the body insisting on reassembling itself despite the fact that the process is visibly awful and Wade is making increasingly desperate small talk to get through it. The joke and the genuine physical horror coexist in a way that the film has been training you to handle since the opening act. What this sequence establishes, practically and emotionally, is that Wade cannot physically stop what's happening at Essex House. His power isn't sufficient for the threat. His legs aren't even fully operational yet. The one tool he's always had, an unkillable body that can recover from anything and keep going, isn't enough here. If he's going to affect the outcome, it can't be through conventional heroics. That constraint is what makes his eventual choice feel like an actual choice rather than a narrative inevitability. The headmaster and the decision that changes everything. Russell reaches the headmaster, the man who ran Essex House, who oversaw the systematic abuse the film has never shown in detail, but made entirely legible through Russell's behavior and rage. He's there. He's cornered, and Russell has Juggernaut and a fully operational power set and every reason the world has handed him to do exactly what he's about to do. This is the moment Cable's timeline says changes everything. Not a massive battle, not a world-ending event. A 16-year-old kid making a decision to kill one specific man in one specific building. The smallness of it, compared to the cosmic scale of most superhero escalation, is precisely the point. The film has always been more interested in the intimate than the epic, and here it commits to that completely. The future pivots on whether one deeply hurt person gets stopped at the moment of a choice that would mark him permanently. Wade gets there. Barely. Still partially rebuilt, moving on the specific kind of desperation that has nothing to do with heroism and everything to do with not being willing to watch a kid he recognizes make a mistake he can't come back from. He plants himself between Russell and the headmaster and starts talking. And this is where Ryan Reynolds does his best work in the entire film. Because Wade doesn't deliver a speech about being a hero. He doesn't tell Russell the future will get better, or that he should choose good for its own sake. He tells Russell, essentially, that the way you find out who you are is by what you do in the moments nobody's going to respect you for either way. That making the choice that costs you something is different from making the choice that satisfies everything you've been feeling. that choosing not to do this specific thing isn't weakness, it's the harder move. It's an argument, not a sermon. Wade is not above Russell in this scene. He's sitting in the same territory, making the same kind of plea he probably needed someone to make to him months ago and never got. The blocking keeps them at similar levels in the frame. Dennison and Reynolds play it as a genuine conversation between two people with equivalent pain, which is the only version of this scene that could possibly work. The shot and the sacrifice Cable's device shows 1 kill away from the chest tattoo that marks Russell in his timeline. 1 death, and the future Cable arrived to prevent closes off forever. Russell is there. The headmaster is there. Wade is between them. When the shooter outside takes the kill shot aimed at the headmaster, Cable's last preventative measure, the bullet that would bypass the ethical problem by removing the target, Wade steps into it. Not dramatically, not in slow motion with swelling score. He just turns, registers what's coming, and moves into the path of it. The choice takes about 1.5 seconds of screen time. The gun fires. Wade takes the round, and his healing factor, exhausted, overtaxed, running on whatever reserve his body is left after being bisected, can't close the wound in time. He goes down. The film goes quiet in a way it almost never does. Not silent. There's ambient sound. There's the texture of the location. But the density of noise and motion that characterizes nearly every other scene in Deadpool 2 drains out. Russell is looking at a man who stepped in front of a bullet, not because it served a tactical objective or advanced a narrative goal, but because that specific kid's specific future was worth one more try. Wade's one request, as he's dying, is that Russell stay. Just don't make the kill. Just stand here for another few minutes while the situation resolves. It's the smallest possible ask in the largest possible moment, and Russell stands there, and the headmaster lives, and the tattoo on Cable's chest device clears. The future Cable came to prevent is closed off. His family might live. The mission is accomplished. Cable's real choice. Here's where the film does something that genuinely surprises you if you've been watching Cable as a mission delivery system rather than a character. He uses his last remaining time jump to save Wade, not to get back to his family, not to verify that the future he came from is actually different, not to ensure his own survival in the past. He uses it to go back approximately 30 seconds and redirect the kill shot onto a teddy bear in Wade's chest pocket, a teddy bear that Vanessa put there in an afterlife sequence in a moment the film has been holding in reserve exactly for this purpose. The mechanics are less important than what the choice means. Cable has spent the entire film defined by what he lost and what he'd sacrificed to prevent it. His willingness to use his last resource, the thing he could have used to go home, on a man he's been trying to kill for the better part of the second act, is the film's clearest statement about what found family actually requires. It requires choosing someone outside your original calculus. It requires extending the logic of sacrifice past the people you started out protecting. Wade lives. The shot deflects off the bear. And Deadpool 2 completes the emotional circuit it's been building since the opening. Not by reuniting Wade with Vanessa or restoring what he lost, but by giving him something he couldn't have manufactured or recruited or planned for. People who stayed. The aftermath and what it means. The film doesn't linger long on resolution, which is consistent with its energy throughout. There's no prolonged denouement, no careful accounting of everyone's changed interior states. What you get instead is a series of quick, specific grace notes that do the emotional work without belaboring it. Russell choosing not to make the kill isn't treated as a transformation. He's still angry, he's still hurt. The orphanage is still a real place with real history that shaped him into someone who needed this much intervention to pull back from a ledge, but he didn't do it. That's the whole thing. Not becoming good, choosing, once, to not do the irreversible thing. The film is honest about how small that victory is and how much work still exists on the other side of it. Cable stays. He doesn't go back. Can't. Now that the device is spent. He's stranded in the present tense of someone else's timeline, which means his entire future is undefined. What the film implies, rather than states, is that this might be all right. That building a life from the current moment forward, without the teleological certainty of a known past and a specific family to return to, is the version of existence almost everyone operates on and somehow survives. Domino collects Peter from the field where he landed safely, which is the most satisfying single-character resolution in the film because Peter absolutely should not have survived any of this, and the film clearly loves him for it. The mid-credits scenes, and what they're actually doing. The mid-credits sequence, in which Wade gets his hands on Cable's time device and starts using it to fix things, is framed as pure fan service and comedy, and it is both of those things. He goes back to save Vanessa. He goes back to stop the X-Force deployment and retrieve Peter from the field before the wind takes him. He shoots Ryan Reynolds before he can accept the Green Lantern script. He puts a bullet through the back of his own head in X-Men Origins, Wolverine. These are jokes, they're very good jokes. But they're also doing something the film cares about structurally. They're showing you a Wade Wilson who, having come back from the edge of his own self-destruction, now wants to use the ability to alter timelines, not for grand cosmic purposes, but for specific, small, personal reasons. Save the woman he loves. Save the powerless man who shouldn't have been there. Correct embarrassments. The emotional scale of those corrections is deliberately domestic. After a movie that built to a moment of genuine sacrifice and asked serious questions about grief, agency, and what one person's presence in another person's life is worth, the mid-credit sequence reminds you that the stakes Deadpool 2 has always been most interested in are the personal ones, not the world. The specific people in your specific orbit, and the version of the future where they're still in it. It's also, notably, the only moment in the entire film where Wade gets to have what he lost. Vanessa is alive in the corrected timeline. The apartment is intact. The conversation about starting a family picks back up from where it was interrupted. The film doesn't play that as a triumphant resolution so much as a quiet suggestion. The reason to stay alive was always just this: the people, the ordinary life, the future that death interrupted. Deadpool 2 ends with a man who started the film trying to die and finishes it choosing, actively and without guarantee of outcome, to live. Not because his grief resolved. Not because the world made itself worth living in on its own terms, but because someone needed him to stay in the specific moment it mattered most, and he stayed, and that staying cost him something real, and that cost was what finally made the decision feel like his. The film doesn't dress that up. It doesn't award Wade a transformation or a title or a clarity he didn't earn. It gives him Russell standing next to him, Cable standing in his timeline with a spent device and an undefined future, Domino somewhere nearby with Peter, and the general chaos of a universe that's still going to throw things at him he didn't ask for. That's the family. That's what Act 3 built toward, through the wreckage of the teen that didn't survive and the kid who almost didn't either, and the soldier who used his last resource on someone he'd been planning to bury, not chosen, survived into. Here's the thing about superhero ensemble casts. Most of them are designed around function. You need the muscle, the brain, the comic relief, the mentor, the love interest, and each character gets assigned a lane they don't drift out of. Deadpool 2 does something messier and more interesting. Almost every significant character in this film is doing double duty, simultaneously serving their plot function and operating as a thematic reflection of someone else. Nobody exists in isolation. Everybody is, in some way, a version of a question. The movie is asking about grief, power, and what you do when the future you planned for disappears. Ryan Reynolds as Wade Wilson, the joke that isn't. Let's start with the obvious one, because the obvious thing about Reynolds in this role isn't actually as simple as it looks. Yes, he's funny. Yes, the fourth wall breaks land. Yes, the rapid-fire pop culture references and physical comedy are technically impressive in their precision and density. But the performance that holds Deadpool 2 together isn't the comedy. It's what Reynolds does in the spaces between the jokes, and those spaces are smaller and more carefully managed than they get credit for. Wade Wilson in this film is, at his core, a man performing wellness. The distinction between performing and being is something Reynolds communicates almost entirely through tempo. When Wade is genuinely engaged, when something breaks through the defensive machinery and lands on the actual person underneath, his timing slows down fractionally. The jokes get a half beat longer before delivery. The body language shifts from projected confidence to something quieter. It's subtle enough that you might not consciously register it the first time, but it accumulates, and by the third act it means you've been watching two performances simultaneously, the one Wade is putting on and the one Reynolds is actually giving. The scene in the icebox where Wade is powerless, collared, and sitting with Russell is the clearest example of what the performance is doing all the way through. There are jokes in that scene. Of course there are. But Reynolds calibrates them differently. They're slower, rougher, less polished. They feel like someone reaching for a familiar tool and finding it doesn't grip the same way it used to. The silence after some of those lines is longer than usual, and in that silence you can see the gap between the character's coping mechanism and the character's actual emotional state, which is the whole movie in miniature. What Reynolds also does, and this is the detail that doesn't get discussed enough, is play Wade's love for Vanessa as completely real rather than as a setup for a superhero origin beat. In the early scenes, before the shooting, there's a warmth in how he occupies space with Morena Baccarin that isn't filtered through irony. He's not performing happiness for her or for the audience. He's just happy, in the plain and slightly surprised way of someone who didn't expect to get this much. That register makes the lost land harder than almost any amount of movie language about grief could, because you've already seen what he had. You don't need to be told what he's missing. Julian Dennison as Russell Collins, the anger that makes sense. Russell is the hardest role in Deadpool 2 to get right because the film is asking Julian Dennison to make a character sympathetic at the exact moments when that character is least likable. Russell, at his most volatile, screaming threats at people, aligning himself with a prison-breaking supervillain, marching toward a building to kill someone, is also Russell at his most understandable. And those two things are supposed to coexist without the film having to editorialize about it. Dennison does this by never playing the anger as a costume. It's not a mode Russell switches into when the plot requires it. It's the continuous ambient temperature of someone who has been treated as a problem to be contained rather than a person to be known, and it comes through even in the film's lighter moments. Watch how Russell responds to small gestures of decency, someone getting his name right, someone actually listening rather than managing. And you see the anger drop a fraction, not disappear but ease, which tells you everything about what would have been possible under different circumstances. The sequence in the icebox where Russell and Wade are talking through the bars is the performance's finest stretch. Russell is deciding in real time whether to trust someone again. Dennison plays that decision not as a dramatic internal monologue, but as a series of micro-assessments, the eyes doing the math on whether this is another adult who will eventually show him the system beneath the friendliness. When he partially, tentatively extends something toward Wade, it's visible not in anything he says but in a relaxation around the eyes and shoulders so slight it almost reads as tiredness rather than trust. The juggernaut alignment, which could easily play as a heel turn, works because Dennison never lets you forget that Russell is 16 and absolutely exhausted. His decision to partner with the most destructive force available isn't made from strength. It's made from the specific kind of desperation that sets in when you've tried every option the system offers and found each one worse than the last. By the time he's marching toward Essex House, he's not a villain. He's a person who ran out of alternatives. Josh Brolin as Cable, the grief that became a plan. Josh Brolin had an interesting challenge with Cable. He had to make a character whose emotional motivation is completely sympathetic feel genuinely threatening for the first half of the film. The trap would be to play him as soft-eyed and wounded from the start, which would drain the conflict of all its tension. Brolin doesn't do that. He plays Cable's grief as something that's been processed entirely into forward motion, compressed, refined, and converted into operational precision. The physical performance does a lot of the work. Brolin moves with a kind of economy that comes from having made the decision not to waste anything anymore. Every action has a purpose. Every word is chosen for efficiency. Every fight is approached as a problem to solve rather than a confrontation to have. There's nothing theatrical about Cable's violence. It's just applied force in the direction of an objective. That restraint, playing grief as compression rather than expression, makes him read as genuinely dangerous in a way that purely angry antagonists rarely are. The humanity surfaces in specific cracks, not in sustained emotional scenes. The photograph of his daughter he carries, the small, worn thing that survives multiple firefights tucked in a pocket, tells you more about Cable's interior life than any amount of dialogue could. How he handles it during moments of doubt or near defeat, the way his grip on it changes depending on whether the mission feels like it's working, is a series of tiny performance choices that constitute an entire parallel emotional story running underneath the action sequences. His pivot at the end, choosing to spend the time device on Wade rather than returning to verify his family's survival, only works because Brolin has been carefully, quietly laying the groundwork for it since he and Wade first stopped fighting long enough to talk. There's a scene where Cable tells Wade about his daughter, and the way Brolin holds himself while delivering those lines, the slight forward lean, the deliberate slowness, the sense of someone protecting something fragile by being very careful with the words, signals that this man is still capable of extending his protectiveness past its original target. The final sacrifice isn't a reversal of his character, it's the completion of it. Zazie Bates as Domino. When ease is the performance, Domino could have been a one-note addition. The new girl with the cool power who gets some good action scenes and an exit. Instead, Zazie Bates turns the character into the film's emotional and philosophical anchor in ways the script only partially demands. The luck power is a writing challenge. It's inherently passive. Things going right isn't dramatically interesting in the conventional sense, and making it work cinematically requires a performance that supplies the energy the power itself doesn't. Bates solves this by playing Domino as someone who's made a genuine peace with uncertainty, and that peace isn't breezy or performative, but settled, considered, almost philosophical. She's not reckless, she's informed. She understands her power well enough to trust it, which is a very different thing from being lucky without knowing it. In the action sequences, Bates' physical choices are consistently active even when the stunt work is carrying the scene. She moves like someone who's always reading the space around her and making micro-adjustments in real time, not reacting to what's happening, but anticipating the direction things are tilting. It makes her luck feel less like a passive cosmic gift and more like a skill set she's developed, which grounds the fantasy in something that feels earned. Her relationship with Wade is the film's best constructed supporting dynamic precisely because it's built on friction that never resolves into full antagonism or full alliance. They disagree about fundamentally important things. Wade's nihilism versus her operational trust in the universe. Wade's elaborate plans versus her preference for positioning and readiness. But neither of them is wrong, and the film doesn't adjudicate between them. It just puts them next to each other and lets you feel the productive tension of two people who are each, in their own way, right about something the other person needs. The supporting cast, doing more with less Colossus, has been in the X-Men films before, but Deadpool 2 is where he becomes genuinely useful as a character rather than a visual element. The Stefan Capicci performance is mostly voice and physicality. Colossus is CGI realized, which means the expressiveness is limited to what can be conveyed through movement and tone. But within those constraints, the character is doing something smart. He's the film's earnest idealist, and earnest idealism in a Deadpool movie is both funnier and more poignant than it would be in virtually any other context. Colossus's absolute commitment to the X-Men's ethical framework, his genuine belief that there's a right way to be a superhero, that restraint and principle are worth maintaining even when they're costing you the fight, reads as slightly absurd next to Wade's operational chaos. But the film never mocks him for it. It treats him with affection. His persistence in believing Wade is redeemable is played as a feature rather than a bug, and the Juggernaut fight, where he absorbs enormous punishment rather than compromising on his principle, retroactively justifies everything the movie has been asking you to extend to him. Vanessa, as a character, operates in a structural constraint that the film has been open about acknowledging. She dies early, which means Morena Baccarin's actual screen time is mostly in flashback and in the afterlife sequences. What she does with that time is establish, with complete precision, why Wade is so undone by her absence. The chemistry between Baccarin and Reynolds is easy and specific rather than performed. They'd bicker and laugh the way people do when they've been in each other's orbit long enough to have private languages and genuine shorthand. The afterlife appearances, where Vanessa functions as Wade's conscience and anchor more than as a presence in the plot, are rendered with a warmth that keeps her from being purely symbolic even when the story is using her as one. Dopinder gets the film's most satisfying supporting arc precisely because it cost the narrative almost nothing to give it to him. His sustained ambition to become a mercenary, played by Karen Sony, with an enthusiasm that exists in perfect comic counterpoint to how genuinely inadvisable the goal is, runs through Deadpool 2 as a low-frequency joke that pays off in the truck sequence when he contributes meaningfully to stopping Juggernaut with exactly the blunt instrument method you'd expect from a man who's been paying very close attention to all the wrong role models. Negasonic Teenage Warhead and Yukio exist in the film's margins, but manage to register distinctly there. Their relationship, openly affectionate, domestically comfortable, the one partnership in the film that isn't defined by conflict or complicated history, provides a visual counterpoint to every other connection in the movie. They're the version of found family that already worked out, and the film uses them as a quiet reminder that the chaotic, difficult version Wade is building isn't the only possible kind. How the characters mirror each other, pull back from the individual performances, and look at the architecture, and Deadpool 2's character design reveals a careful structural symmetry. Wade and Russell are mirrors of the same person at different points in the same trajectory, both defined by loss, both using external behavior to manage internal pain, both needing someone to stay long enough to matter. Wade and Cable are mirrors of the same grief processed through different prisms, one through absurdism and self-destruction, one through mission and control. Wade and Domino are mirrors of the same radical uncertainty, one drowning in it, one navigating it with hard-won ease. That kind of character architecture doesn't happen accidentally, and it's worth naming because it's what keeps Deadpool 2 from being a collection of entertaining performances in search of a point. Every principal character is a version of the central question the film is turning over. What do you do with loss you can't outrun? And what does the answer say about who you are? And the variation in their answers is what generates the film's dramatic and comedic texture simultaneously. Reynolds, Dennison, Brolin, and Beats are each doing specific, considered work in service of that architecture. None of them are just showing up. None of them are coasting on type. And the fact that the film manages to sustain genuine dramatic stakes while also landing jokes at a rate most straight comedies can't maintain is not separate from the quality of the performances. It's a direct product of them. When the performances work this precisely, the jokes don't undercut the emotion. They protect it, carrying it forward through scenes that would collapse under their own weight if the audience was asked to hold them undiluted. Every laugh in Deadpool 2 is doing the work of keeping you in a story about grief and redemption that would otherwise be too painful to sit in for 2 hours. That's not a comedy technique. That's a survival strategy. And it's the same strategy Wade Wilson has been using since before the movie started. Most people who love Deadpool 2 love it for what it says. The jokes, the emotional gut punches, the meta-commentary, the character moments. Fewer people talk about how it's made, which is a shame because the technical execution of this film is doing an enormous amount of invisible heavy lifting. The craft isn't showy. It doesn't announce itself the way a prestige drama's cinematography does, or demand attention the way an auteur film's editing does. It works by staying precisely calibrated to the tone at every moment, by knowing exactly when to cut, when to hold, when to let the camera drift, and when to lock it down, and by building an audio landscape that operates on at least 3 simultaneous registers at all times. That invisibility is its own kind of achievement. A technically clumsy Deadpool 2 would have collapsed under the weight of its own tonal ambition. The reason the comedy and the tragedy coexist without canceling each other out isn't just writing and performance. It's craft, applied with discipline from a director who knows exactly what he's doing. David Leitch's action philosophy, geography as character. David Leitch came up as a stunt coordinator and performer before he became a director, and that background shapes how Deadpool 2 stages its action sequences in ways that are immediately visible if you know what to look for. The fundamental principle that runs through his work, here, in Atomic Blonde, in John Wick as co-director, is that geography matters. Where bodies are in space relative to each other, what's between them, how they move through obstacles. These aren't just logistical concerns for Leitch, they're the primary language through which his action sequences communicate character and intention. In the truck convoy sequence, this principle is operating at full capacity. Cable moves through the transport vehicles with surgical linearity. His path is essentially a straight line from entry point to target, with obstacles treated as temporary delays rather than reasons to change direction. Every choice he makes in that space is subordinate to the objective. Wade, by contrast, moves laterally, reactively, building improvisational solutions from whatever's immediately available: a vehicle, a door, an opponent's momentum turned back against them. The convoy isn't just a set piece. It's a physical argument between 2 different theories of how you accomplish things, staged spatially so you understand the argument without anyone having to explain it. The prison break sequence applies the same logic at a different scale. Juggernaut's movement through the icebox is pure, straight-line force. The building isn't an obstacle for him, it's a series of temporary partitions he hasn't gotten to yet. Watching the facility come apart around a human-sized hole moving through it in a direct path is both terrifying and almost mathematical, and the camera work respects that by staying wide enough to show the geometry of destruction rather than fragmenting it into close-up chaos. You always know where the threat is. You always know how far it's moved. The geography is transparent, and that transparency is what makes the threat feel real rather than just impressive. The Colossus versus Juggernaut fight operates on a 3rd spatial register entirely. This one is about containment and its failure. Colossus is trying to establish perimeters, to create space he can control and force the fight into terms he can manage. Juggernaut is simply ignoring every perimeter Colossus tries to establish. The camera follows each of their attempts to define the space of the fight, and the action communicates, without dialogue, exactly what Colossus is up against. Not just superior force, but superior indifference to the entire framework he's fighting within. Jonathan Sella's cinematography, color as emotional temperature. The director of photography on Deadpool 2, Jonathan Sella, made choices about color and light that are doing consistent emotional work throughout the film, even when you're not consciously tracking them. The basic temperature system is straightforward. Once you see it, warm, saturated amber and gold for the Vanessa sequences and the afterlife appearances, cooler, more desaturated tones for the icebox and the periods of Wade's emotional collapse, high contrast, kinetically lit frames for action sequences that need energy without warmth. What's more interesting is how the film uses color specifically to mark Wade's interior state rather than just the location or the time of day. The apartment, which should be a neutral domestic space, is photographed in the kind of warm, slightly overexposed light that cinematographers use for memory, as if even when you're seeing it in the present tense, the camera is acknowledging that this is the version of the space that Wade will be mourning later. It's a very specific choice that only registers fully on a rewatch, when you know what's coming and can feel the camera already treating these moments as past tense. The icebox sequences go further in the opposite direction than almost any other stretch of the film. The color is drained almost completely, Grays and pale blues, harsh fluorescent adjacent practical light, no softness anywhere in the frame. Sella and Leach are not trying to make these scenes unpleasant to look at exactly, but they're making them feel fundamentally different from the film's natural register, which underscores the collar's effect on Wade more viscerally than the dialogue about powerlessness can on its own. It looks like how it feels to have the thing that defines you switched off. The Essex House finale reintroduces color. Fire, specifically, which brings warmth back to the palette in the most antagonistic way possible, and Sella uses that contrast deliberately. The building burning isn't beautiful, but it's warm in a way the prison wasn't, and that warmth carries a complicated charge, destruction that feels alive, which is exactly the ambivalence the film wants you sitting in while Russell makes his choice. Tyler Bates, and the score that eats itself. Tyler Bates composed the Deadpool 2 score with a specific mandate that most film composers never receive: write music that is fully aware of what it's doing and is willing to comment on itself. The result is a soundtrack that operates on two levels simultaneously. It provides conventional scoring functions, establishing tone, building tension, underscoring emotion, while simultaneously being willing to break those functions open for comedic or ironic effect. The clearest example is the choral work that Bates uses throughout the film's action sequences. There's a grandeur to the choir placements, the kind of expansive, heroic vocalizing that superhero films deploy in their most serious moments, but Bates times them to hit specifically on beats that don't merit that level of solemnity. A ridiculous death, a botched entry, a moment of physical comedy that would normally get a comedic sting or silence instead receives this enormous cathedral choir swell, and the gap between the musical claim and the visual reality is where the joke lives. You're laughing at the music as much as the image, which is an unusual thing to do with a film score. The Ashes deployment is a separate and more sophisticated move. The Celine Dion original, commissioned specifically for the film, performed over a credit sequence that features Dion herself with backing dancers in an elaborate music video, is at once a genuine piece of adult contemporary music and a pitch-perfect parody of exactly that kind of music. It's earnest and ridiculous simultaneously, which is the entire Deadpool 2 tonal project compressed into 4 minutes. What makes it work as more than a joke is that Ashes is actually a song about aftermath and loss, about what you're left with when the fire goes out, and the lyrics, underneath the deliberate overselling of every musical choice, are genuinely relevant to what the film has been doing. Bates and the production understood that the best version of that joke was one that also functioned as a real song about real things, which is a much harder needle to thread than it sounds. The more intimate score choices, the quieter cues under Wade and Vanessa's early scenes, the spare, somewhat mournful textures under the icebox sequences are less audacious but equally precise. Bates knows when the comedy needs underlining and when it needs breathing room, and the score's restraint in the film's more emotionally exposed moments is what allows those moments to land, rather than being buried under self-awareness. The VFX problem and how they solved it. Deadpool 2 has a specific visual effects challenge that most superhero films don't face. It needs its effects to be simultaneously impressive and funny. An effect that's too polished undermines the joke. An effect that's too rough undermines the action. Almost every major VFX sequence in the film is navigating that tension in real time. Domino's luck sequences are the clearest example of the creative solution. The visual language developed for her power, slow-motion probability chains, where things break or move in Domino's favor through a series of causally connected micro-events, is genuinely innovative. Rather than showing the luck as a visible force field or a glow or any conventional superhero power visual language, the effects team built a system where the camera lingers on the chain reactions long enough for the audience to track the causality. You see the thing that was about to go wrong and then see, precisely, why it didn't. The effect isn't supernatural in appearance. Everything that happens is physically possible, but the timing and sequence of it communicates the improbability clearly. The comedic version of this is the sequence where Domino descends into the convoy and everything in the environment starts rearranging itself in her favor in increasingly elaborate ways. A container swings at the right moment. A vehicle turns left when it should turn right. An explosion redirects debris. Leach and the effects team shoot this in sustained, wide shots rather than cutting around it, which means you see the whole chain at once rather than piecing it together from fragments, and that holistic view is what makes it funny. You're watching probability being mugged by the universe in real time, and the scale of the rigging job is the punchline. Juggernaut's realization as a fully CGI character is a different kind of VFX achievement, because the brief here was scale and weight rather than elegant. The challenge with large CGI figures, and the reason so many of them feel unconvincing, is that digital work struggles to communicate mass in the way practical effects do naturally. The Juggernaut team addressed this primarily through animation and sound design rather than render quality, the way his feet interact with surfaces, the speed at which debris settles after impact, the audio of his movement. All of these elements are calibrated to make him feel heavy rather than to make him look detailed. It's an approach that prioritizes physical plausibility over visual fidelity, and it works considerably better than a hyper-realistic rendered character would have, especially in a film that's already leaning into performative excess everywhere else. Editing, comedy, is timing, and timing is editing. The editing on Deadpool 2, handled by Craig Alpert and Dirk Westervelt, is doing something technically demanding that almost never gets discussed in reviews of the film. It's maintaining two simultaneous rhythms in almost every sequence, one comedic and one dramatic, without letting either one override the other. Comedy editing operates on the principle of precision. The cut has to come at the exact frame, not a frame before or after, for the punchline to work. The joke beat, the reaction beat, the cutaway, each of these has a timing window measured in fractions of a second, and missing it is the difference between a laugh and a near miss. Deadpool 2 is dense with gags that require this kind of precision cutting, and the editors deliver it consistently across a runtime that never feels like it's straining to sustain its own pace. What makes this specifically impressive is that the same sequences also have to sustain dramatic momentum. The icebox conversations between Wade and Russell are cut primarily for emotional pacing rather than joke timing, but jokes still happen in them, and those jokes have to land without breaking the tonal register that makes the emotional content believable. The editors navigate this by giving the dramatic beats more room, longer holds on faces, more generous pauses before and after significant exchanges, while keeping the comic beats crisp. The result is a rhythm that shifts between registers without feeling like it's lurching, which is a much rarer achievement than it sounds. The X-Force death sequence is perhaps the film's single greatest editing set piece, precisely because it has to time comedy with brutal finality simultaneously. Each death lands differently, some fast, some extended, each with its own comedic logic, and the cuts between them have to keep the sequence moving while giving each death enough screen time to register as both funny and final. It's a sequence that could easily turn mean-spirited if the timing were off by a few frames, but Alpert and Westervelt calibrated as celebration rather than cruelty, and the editing is most of why. Sound design, the layer nobody talks about. Deadpool 2's sound design is the technical element most completely invisible to most audiences, which is precisely how good sound design works. You don't hear it as separate from the experience, you just experience the film more fully because of it. The specific innovation here is the way ambient sound is used to modulate the film's tonal register. In the highest energy action sequences, the soundscape is dense and layered, multiple effects tracks, the score, dialogue, all competing for space in a way that mirrors the kinetic chaos of the images. In the film's more exposed emotional moments, that density drops away sharply. The icebox scenes have a specific acoustic quality, slightly reverberant, thin, with a low ambient hum that suggests institutional systems, that makes them feel physically different from the rest of the film. You hear the difference before you consciously notice it. The color's effect on Wade's healing factor is communicated sonically as much as visually. When the inhibitor activates, there's a specific cessation in the low-frequency layer of the mix that's been present whenever Deadpool uses his powers, and its absence registers as something subtracted from the world rather than just something blocked from a character. It's a sound design choice that rewards the kind of active listening most people don't bring to action films, but which pays off in a felt sense that something essential has changed in the scene's stakes. Juggernaut gets an individual sound design treatment that's worth noting separately. Every impact he generates has a specific sonic signature that combines conventional explosion impact effects with a low-frequency resonance designed to be felt physically rather than just heard. In theaters with adequate speaker systems, Juggernaut doesn't just look large. He sounds like something the building is aware of, which is the most effective communication of his scale the film achieves. Why the craft matters for the tone pull, all of these technical elements together, and what you have is a film that's been engineered at every level to maintain the specific tonal balancing act that defines Deadpool 2's identity. The color tells you what to feel before the dialogue confirms it. The score signals sincerity and then eats its own signal with a choir hit that lands on a terrible death. The editing calibrates your laugh timing while keeping the dramatic register alive. The sound design subtracts things from the world to make you feel the losses before the plot names them. None of this is accidental, and none of it is simple. Making a film that's genuinely funny and genuinely moving in the same beats requires craft operating at exceptional precision, because imprecision, a cut half a second too late, a color temperature slightly off, a score cue that doesn't modulate cleanly between registers, collapses the tonal balance instantly. The fact that Deadpool 2 sustains that balance for nearly 2 hours across a story covering suicide, child abuse, grief, and a man getting torn in half is the film's quietest and most significant technical achievement. It's the work that makes all the other work possible. Deadpool 2 will let you watch it as a very good action comedy and never demand anything more from you. The jokes work on their own terms. The set pieces deliver. The performances are entertaining without requiring deep engagement. You can walk out of a screening having had an excellent time and having processed almost none of what the film was genuinely working through underneath all of that noise, and it will have served you well regardless. But there's another film operating inside the comedy. Quieter, more uncomfortable, more willing to sit with things that most mainstream superhero productions won't touch, and understanding that film doesn't make the funny parts less funny. It makes the whole thing more coherent. The themes aren't hidden exactly, they're just wrapped in enough absurdist packaging that you can decline to unwrap them if you prefer. This is, it turns out, itself thematically appropriate for a movie whose central character has spent his entire existence using jokes as insulation against things he can't bear to look at directly. Grief as operating system. Most films about grief treat it as a condition to be resolved. There's a before, an acute phase, and an after, usually signaled by the character crying properly, having a breakthrough conversation, or performing some ritual of release. The arc tends toward recovery because recovery is what audiences expect and what narrative grammar demands. The character grieves, works through it, and emerges into the next phase of their life carrying the loss but no longer controlled by it. Deadpool 2 refuses this structure almost completely. Wade's grief isn't an arc. It's the film's operational logic. It's the state that generates every decision, every relationship, every action sequence, and character conflict in the story. The movie doesn't ask when Wade will be done grieving. It asks what grief looks like when the person experiencing it can't die, can't process, through exhaustion, can't get sick enough to force rest, and has spent years developing a comedy routine specifically calibrated to prevent anyone from getting close enough to see what's actually happening underneath. That's a very specific portrait of grief, and it corresponds to a real phenomenon that clinical language calls complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder, the version where loss doesn't resolve through the normal phases, but instead becomes a permanent internal weather system. Wade's healing factor is a literal metaphor for the way complicated grief works. It regenerates the surface constantly, keeps the exterior functioning, but doesn't touch whatever's actually damaged beneath. You look healed. You can move through the world. The wound is still there, unchanged, doing its quiet work. The film's decision to frame this through suicide attempts rather than through conventional mourning sequences is its most audacious thematic choice. Wade's multiple, inventive self-destructions in the early acts are played for laughs, but the laughs exist in precise tension with what's actually being depicted, a person trying to end his own life repeatedly, failing because his body won't cooperate, and treating that failure as faintly absurd rather than as a reason to continue. The comedy doesn't diffuse the darkness. It demonstrates how the darkness gets managed. You make it funny because the alternative is sitting in it without protection. The suicidality question. There's a specific ethical tightrope that Deadpool 2 walks in depicting Wade's suicidal period, and it's worth examining carefully rather than either praising or condemning the approach reflexively. The concern with depicting suicidality in popular media, and it's a legitimate concern, is that certain framings can romanticize the impulse, treat it as sophisticated or poetic, or present it in ways that model harmful patterns for vulnerable audiences. Deadpool 2 sidesteps most of these risks through a very deliberate formal choice. It makes Wade's attempts look stupid rather than beautiful. The montage of failed self-destructions isn't filmed with elegiac cinematography or mournful score cues. It's filmed like a series of increasingly poor decisions made by someone who isn't thinking clearly. Messy, physically ugly, ineffective, and stripped of any aesthetic that might code them as desirable or profound. The humor directed at these sequences is specifically the humor of absurdity rather than the humor of coolness. Wade isn't romanticized for trying to die. He looks like a man who has run out of ideas and is executing the worst of them. More importantly, the film never endorses the impulse. The entire story structure is built around the proposition that Wade is wrong about his own dispensability, that Russell needs him, that his presence in the world creates outcomes that his absence cannot replicate, that the specific, irreplaceable shape of one person's engagement with another person matters in ways that don't resolve themselves through absence. The film makes this argument not through a character turning to Wade and explaining why life is worth living, but through plot mechanics that demonstrate it. Russell's trajectory changes because of Wade specifically, not because of abstract intervention. Cable uses his last resource on Wade specifically. The mid-credits corrections are all about Wade specifically going back to preserve specific people. The message isn't that life is universally precious in an abstract sense, it's narrower and more honest than that. This particular person, in this particular context, is not as replaceable as he believes himself to be. That's a much more defensible claim than most inspirational narratives about depression manage, and it's grounded in the specific story rather than in generalized uplift. The cycle of abuse. Russell and the Essex house. The Essex house thread is where Deadpool 2 goes furthest beyond what superhero films typically engage with, and it does so without ever abandoning its tonal register entirely. The institution at the center of Russell's trauma. A state-sanctioned facility that frames systematic abuse as therapeutic intervention, that hurts children and calls it help, that weaponizes the language of care to maintain control, is not an abstract evil. It's a recognizable structure. It functions the way certain real institutions have functioned, and the film names that clearly without turning into a social issue drama. Russell's arc is built around a specific question that the abuse literature has been grappling with for decades. What is the relationship between experiencing violence and perpetrating it? The cycle of abuse, the pattern by which people who've been hurt in specific ways tend, under certain conditions, to reproduce those patterns, is real, well documented, and deeply uncomfortable to discuss because acknowledging the pattern risks implying determinism, which is both empirically wrong and ethically dangerous. People who've been abused don't inevitably become abusers. The pattern is a tendency, not a destiny, and breaking it is possible. Russell is on the edge of the cycle at his most dangerous moments. He's turning toward violence not out of enjoyment, but out of the specific logic that the abuse literature identifies as most dangerous, the sense that the only legible form of power is the kind that was used against you. He's learned that power means hurting people before they hurt you, because every institution that was supposed to protect him has demonstrated that lesson consistently. The film isn't excusing his choices, it's explaining the architecture that built the conditions for those choices, and that distinction is crucial. Wade's intervention works not because he out-argues Russell or out-fights the people who abused him, but because he does something none of those institutions did. He stays present without an agenda. He doesn't need Russell to be okay. He doesn't need Russell to become useful or manageable. He just needs Russell to not make the specific, irreversible choice in the specific moment. And the lack of any ulterior requirement behind that need is what Russell can't quite categorize. He's never been wanted without conditions before. The confusion that produces the slight loosening Dennison plays across the icebox scenes is the first evidence that the cycle isn't sealed. Found family, the concept under pressure. Deadpool 2 invokes family, constantly. As a joke, as a theme, as a running gag about the Fast and Furious franchise, as a serious claim about what the story is ultimately about. The film knows exactly how much it's leaning on the concept, and its awareness of the cliché is part of how it manages the cliché. By openly acknowledging that family is a superhero film trope, while also building a story that genuinely turns on the concept, it preempts the cynicism that would otherwise deflate the emotional resolution. What the film actually argues about family is more interesting than the invocation of the concept suggests. It's not arguing that chosen family is inherently better than biological family, or that love conquers all, or that the right people always find each other. It's arguing something smaller and harder, that family, in the meaningful sense, is constituted by survival, by the specific people who are still there after the version of the situation that was supposed to work has already failed. The X-Force, assembled with intention and care and a proper team name, doesn't constitute family. What's left after the wind? Cable without a home, Domino without a mission, Peter just alive. Does. That argument has implications for how you read the film's ending. Wade doesn't end up with the family he originally wanted, he ends up with the one that showed up in the chaos and stayed. Cable is there not by design, but because he spent his exit. Domino is there because the situation called for her. Even Russell, the kid Wade saved, isn't a triumph of Wade's planning. He's the result of one moment of clarity inside a sequence of bad decisions and worse odds. The family is an accident that everyone chose to stop being accidental about, which is a more truthful account of how families actually form than most narratives about the concept manage. Meta without nihilism. The genre commentary that still cares. Deadpool 2 comments on superhero films continuously. It flags fridging the moment it fridges Vanessa, acknowledges the absurdity of the recruitment montage while executing one, mocks the earnestness of X-Men-style moral instruction while also taking its own version of that instruction seriously. It knows every trope it's deploying, names most of them, and deploys them anyway. The question this raises, and it's a real question, not a rhetorical one, is whether that level of self-awareness constitutes genuine commentary or just inoculation against criticism. If you acknowledge the fridge before you put someone in it, are you critiquing the trope, or are you just getting ahead of the discourse while doing the same thing you'd have done anyway? The film's answer to this, embedded in structure rather than stated, is that awareness of a problem and inability to fully escape it can coexist honestly. Vanessa dies because the story needs Wade's grief as its engine, and the film knows that's a cost. The mid-credits correction, where Wade goes back and keeps her alive, is the movie acknowledging that debt and partially paying it while understanding that the structure of the story required the borrowing in the first place. That's not a clean resolution of the problem, but it's a more honest engagement with it than either ignoring the issue or pretending the correction retroactively makes the original choice costly. The broader meta-commentary, the fourth wall breaks, the genre parody, the explicit references to the Marvel Cinematic Universe the film existed outside of, operates as a kind of pressure valve. It prevents the film from taking itself too seriously while also preventing the comedy from becoming purely defensive. The jokes about the genre are made by someone who clearly loves the genre. The parody comes from affection rather than contempt, which is why it lands as warm rather than mean-spirited. You can't parody something effectively if you don't understand it deeply, and Deadpool 2's meta-commentary demonstrates deep understanding of precisely what it's mocking. The healing factor, as metaphor, unpacking the central symbol. It would be easy to miss how consistently the film uses Wade's healing factor as symbolic language rather than just as a narrative mechanism. The regeneration that makes him nearly unkillable isn't just a superpower, it's the story's central metaphor for the way certain kinds of damage get managed without being resolved. When the collar removes the healing factor in the icebox, it's removing the thing that keeps Wade from having to sit with the full weight of his own mortality and vulnerability. The collar doesn't just make him weaker physically, it makes him present in a way he normally isn't, because normally the healing factor absorbs consequence before it can accumulate. With it gone, damage sticks, pain lasts. Decisions carry weight that can be opted out of when regeneration is available. The film is asking, underneath the action movie logic, whether healing too quickly is itself a form of avoidance, whether the ability to recover from anything, physically, and by extension emotionally through comedy and deflection, prevents the kind of damage that forces real change. Wade needs the collar, in a sense, before he can have the conversation with Russell that matters. He needs to be in a state where staying present is the only option because escape is temporarily unavailable. His regeneration returning at the end of the icebox sequence doesn't restore the status quo. He comes back with a healing factor and without the numbness that previously accompanied it, still capable of getting up, but no longer doing so to avoid sitting with things. That's a subtle shift, almost invisible in the action, but it's the difference between a character who survives and a character who chooses to survive, and the film has been building toward that distinction since its very first scene. What the film believes, strip every theme back to its foundational claim, and Deadpool 2 is ultimately making one argument, that the decision to stay present in someone else's life, specifically, without guarantee of outcome, without certainty of being wanted, and at genuine personal cost, is the most meaningful thing a person can do, not the most heroic thing. Not the most powerful or strategically wise or emotionally satisfying thing, the most meaningful. Wade stays present for Russell without knowing whether it'll work. Cable stays present in the present tense of a timeline that isn't his original one. Domino stays when the mission technically dissolved in a field of dead parachutists. Even Peter, reliably, gloriously, pointlessly, stays because he saw an ad and showed up and decided that was enough of a commitment to honor. The film doesn't dress that up as heroism or destiny. It doesn't give anyone a speech about why they made those choices. It just shows you the choices being made and trusts you to understand what it cost each person to make them and leaves the meaning sitting there without a label on it. For a movie that never stops talking, that final thematic reticence is its most elegant gesture. When Deadpool 2 opened in May 2018, the conversation around it was almost entirely about whether it could repeat what the first film had done. The original Deadpool had been a genuine industry disruption, an R-rated superhero film that nobody at the studio level believed in, greenlit partly through a leaked test footage campaign that essentially forced Fox's hand and then proceeded to become the highest-grossing R-rated film in history at the time of its release. The sequel arrived with that legacy as both an asset and a pressure system. The question wasn't whether Deadpool 2 would be good. The question was whether it could justify the franchise's existence as something more than a profitable anomaly. The answer the box office delivered was unambiguous. Deadpool 2 opened to approximately $125 million domestically in its opening weekend and eventually crossed $785 million worldwide against a production budget of around $110 million. That's not just a successful sequel. That's a confirmation that the first film's audience hadn't been a one-time phenomenon, that there was a sustained appetite for this specific kind of superhero storytelling that didn't depend on the novelty of the original's existence. The R rating wasn't a liability. The meta-commentary wasn't alienating casual viewers. The emotional weight the sequel added, the grief, the suicidality, the abuse narrative hadn't pushed away the audience that came for the jokes. If anything, it pulled them deeper in. Critics responded with a complicated affection that Deadpool 2 specifically seemed engineered to produce. The consensus was roughly that it was slightly messier than the original, slightly more ambitious, and significantly more interesting thematically, with those last two qualities doing enough to compensate for the first. The performances, particularly Reynolds and Brolin, drew consistent praise. The tonal balancing act got recognized. The X-Force sequence was almost universally cited as one of the year's best comedic set pieces. The Vanessa death got more criticism than anything else in the film, a response the filmmakers clearly anticipated and then addressed in the mid-credits timeline correction in a way that was itself a kind of acknowledgement of the critique. What the reviews couldn't fully capture in real time, what only becomes clear with distance, is the position Deadpool 2 occupies in the broader history of what superhero films are allowed to be. The R rating and what it actually unlocked. Before Deadpool, the R-rated superhero film was essentially a dead letter. The logic was straightforward. From a studio perspective, superhero properties were tentpole investments, and tentpole investments needed the broadest possible audience, which meant PG-13 ratings, which meant keeping violence, language, and thematic darkness within certain parameters. The occasional exception existed. Blade, the Punisher films, some of the darker comic adaptations, but none of them had the mainstream commercial profile to shift the industry's assumption. Deadpool didn't just prove that an R-rated superhero film could make money. It proved that the rating itself could be part of the product's identity, that audiences would specifically seek out the R-rated version of something because the rating communicated a promise about the kind of experience they were going to have. The violence, the language, the willingness to go to places PG-13 narratives couldn't. These weren't compromises on commercial viability. They were features, and audiences were buying them as features. Deadpool 2 consolidated that proof of concept. It demonstrated that the first film's success wasn't dependent on originality alone, that an R-rated sequel, a known quantity without the surprise factor of the first installment, could sustain the same commercial energy. That's a different and arguably more important demonstration, because sequels are the real test of whether a franchise model works. One successful film is an outlier. Two is a pattern. And patterns change how studios greenlight things. The direct lineage from Deadpool through Deadpool 2 to what followed runs through several significant films. Logan, which had been in development separately but released between the two Deadpool films, was made possible partly by the commercial argument those films established. James Mangold's decision to make a genuinely somber R-rated Western about aging and mortality featuring the X-Men universe's most iconic character was a bet the studio could only seriously consider after Deadpool demonstrated that the adult-skewing audience existed and was reliable. Logan then did something Deadpool hadn't. It won critical respect of a different kind, earning an Academy Award nomination for its screenplay and getting taken seriously in conversations about prestige filmmaking in a way superhero films almost never do. Together, the Deadpool franchise and Logan created the conditions for a new conversation about what superhero films could aspire to. The Joker question and the downstream conversation. The thread from Deadpool 2 to Todd Phillips's Joker in 2019 is less direct but worth tracing because Joker is where the R-rated superhero conversation took its most extreme form. Phillips made an R-rated comic book adaptation that functioned as a character study in the tradition of 1970s American cinema, Taxi Driver, as often invoked as a reference point, and it became the first R-rated film to gross over $1 billion worldwide. That number had been unthinkable before Deadpool proved that the rating wasn't a ceiling. The comparison between Joker and the Deadpool films also illuminates something important about the range of what R-rated superhero storytelling can be. Deadpool 2 uses its rating for comedy, for emotional honesty, and for action sequences that can show full consequence rather than cutting away. Joker uses its rating for psychological intensity, social discomfort, and a portrait of mental illness that the PG-13 framework couldn't have supported. They're almost opposite applications of the same commercial license, and the fact that both found massive audiences confirms that the R rating unlocked a space rather than defined a genre. It's not that audiences want dark superhero films specifically, it's that they want superhero films that can make full use of the storytelling tools available to adult drama. The Deadpool franchise's specific contribution to that space was always its tonal range, not just the violence and language, but the willingness to put real psychological weight into a comedy, to use humor not as an alternative to sincerity, but as its carrier medium. That's a narrower innovation than the rating itself, but it's arguably a more interesting one because it created a template for how to do emotionally serious things inside an entertainment vehicle that audiences were going to see for entirely frivolous reasons. Reach them through the jokes, keep them through the meaning. That's not a formula anyone had quite figured out at scale in the superhero genre before Deadpool, and Deadpool 2 refined it. Celine Dion, Ashes, and the cultural footprint. Cultural impact is a tricky thing to measure, and the instinct is always to reach for box office numbers or awards as proxies. But Deadpool 2's cultural footprint is more visible in stranger places than those metrics capture. The Celine Dion collaboration produced one of the more genuinely unusual artifacts in recent popular music history. Ashes, a full original song produced for a superhero sequel, performed by one of the most recognizable voices in adult contemporary music over an elaborate music video sequence featuring backup dancers in superhero contexts, should not have worked as well as it did. It's absurd! It's also genuinely moving in the way that only things that commit fully to being both absurd and sincere can be, and it became a minor cultural moment independent of the film. The music video accumulated views, the song got radio play in some markets. Celine Dion performing it at the Billboard Music Awards in 2018 was the kind of surreal crossover event that doesn't happen when a project is just commercially competent. It happens when something resonates at a frequency that audiences weren't prepared for. The film's specific jokes entered the cultural vocabulary in the way that only comedy with genuine craft does, not as widely repeated phrases, but as reference points for people who saw it, shorthand for specific types of situations. The X-Force deployment scene became a reference for catastrophic plan failures. Peter became an unlikely symbol of enthusiastic civilian participation in things above his pay grade. The Juggernaut reveal, specifically the voice reveal, which carries an Easter egg about the franchise's history that audiences recognized in real time, generated the kind of theatrical response that gets described in reviews but only exists in the shared experience of a packed opening weekend crowd processing something together. The mid-credits sequences specifically entered the cultural conversation about franchise filmmaking in an interesting way. The Ryan Reynolds shooting Ryan Reynolds gag, the Green Lantern correction, the X-Men origins, Wolverine fix. These weren't just jokes. They were a public statement about how Reynolds and the creative team understood the relationship between this franchise and the larger history it came from, and that statement landed with an audience that had been watching that history and had opinions about it. The mid-credits scenes functioned as the film's most direct address to its own fan base, and the response they generated confirmed that the fan base was there, paying attention and appreciating being spoken to as participants in the conversation rather than passive consumers of a product. The Once Upon a Deadpool digression. In December 2018, Fox released Once Upon a Deadpool, a PG-13 re-edit of Deadpool 2 framed as a bedtime story narrated by Reynolds to Fred Savage, a parody of The Princess Bride. This version added new framing material, removed or altered the R-rated content, and positioned itself as a charitable release with a portion of proceeds going to the Fudge Cancer Campaign. Once Upon a Deadpool is a footnote rather than a major event, but it's a philosophically interesting one. The project essentially asked, what is Deadpool 2 without its R rating? The answer it provided was that the film's emotional architecture, the grief, the family thesis, the character work, survives the edit in ways that pure action spectacle wouldn't, because those elements weren't dependent on the R-rated content for their power. The core story remains coherent and moving in a PG-13 format, which retroactively confirms that the rating in Deadpool 2 was serving the tone rather than carrying the substance. Take away the blood and language, and you lose texture and comedy, but the story underneath was always built to hold weight independently. That's not nothing. It's evidence that the filmmakers built something structurally sound rather than just commercially shrewd, and that the emotional ambitions of the sequel were genuine rather than grafted onto a franchise that needed to justify its continued existence with adult-sounding themes. Ryan Reynolds and what this franchise made possible. It's difficult now, after the success of Deadpool and Wolverine in 2024, to fully recover the sense of how much was riding on Ryan Reynolds' personal investment in this franchise. Reynolds has spent years developing the original Deadpool from a passion project, acquiring the rights, developing scripts, advocating internally at Fox, before the test footage leak created the conditions that made it viable. The first film was his film, in a way that most actors' relationships to franchises aren't, and Deadpool 2, while bringing in David Leitch and expanding the creative team, maintained that quality of personal ownership. The Reynolds persona that Deadpool made globally legible, the specific brand of self-aware, rapid-fire, emotionally sincere comedy that his aviation gin commercials and Wrexham AFC ownership would later extend into adjacent cultural spaces, was always there in his work before Deadpool. It hadn't found its optimal delivery vehicle. Wade Wilson is, by design, the character this specific performer was always best equipped to play, and Deadpool 2 is where that fit between actor and role reaches its fullest expression. The sequel gave Reynolds more emotional range to work with than the original did, and the places where he went quiet and specific, the icebox scenes, the sacrifice, the mid-credits corrections, are where you see what the franchise's tonal ambition allowed him to do that a purely comedic superhero film wouldn't have. His subsequent trajectory, the MCU integration, the expanded production involvement, the Deadpool and Wolverine 2024 release that became the highest-grossing R-rated film in history, is continuous with the work Deadpool 2 established. The cultural capital Reynolds built in this franchise wasn't just commercial. He built credibility as a producer and creative force who could sustain a long-form creative vision across multiple films, which is a different and rarer achievement than simply being the lead of a successful franchise. The MCU integration and what it changed. Deadpool and Wolverine's 2024 release. The first MCU film with an R rating. The first integration of the Fox X-Men universe characters into the Disney-owned Marvel Cinematic Universe is downstream from everything Deadpool 2 built, and it's worth understanding what specifically it inherited, rather than just noting the connection. The meta-commentary infrastructure that Deadpool 2 developed. The fourth wall breaks. The franchise self-awareness, the explicit acknowledgement of corporate ownership and cinematic universe mechanics, became the primary mode through which Deadpool and Wolverine handled its own integration challenge. Bringing a character known for commenting on superhero movies into the studio that owns the dominant superhero movie universe required a level of self-referential sophistication that the earlier films had been training the audience to receive. Deadpool 2's willingness to directly address Fox's X-Men history, its relationship to the broader Marvel franchise it existed adjacent to, and its own status as a sequel performing awareness of sequelhood, all of that established the tonal permission that Deadpool and Wolverine needed to exist in the form it took. The R rating's preservation in the MCU context is, practically speaking, the most significant thing that happened to superhero filmmaking as a result of the Deadpool franchise's success. Disney, which had maintained PG-13 as an essentially inviolable standard across its superhero properties for over a decade, agreed to produce and release an R-rated film under the Marvel Studios banner. That decision was commercially motivated. The Deadpool franchise's financial track record made the case that the adult audience was large and reliable enough to justify it. But the commercial case only existed because the films themselves had been made with genuine craft and genuine emotional ambition. You can't make the financial argument for artistic seriousness if you haven't first demonstrated the artistic seriousness. The conversation Deadpool 2 opened about tone and rating and audience in 2018 found its institutional resolution 6 years later when the studio that defines mainstream superhero filmmaking decided to expand its parameters. That's not a small legacy. The Vanessa problem. Revisited. Any honest accounting of Deadpool 2's legacy has to sit with its most contested element, the decision to kill Vanessa in the opening act. The criticism that followed, that fridging the female lead of the first film to generate the male protagonist's emotional journey, was a retrograde storytelling choice regardless of the film's self-awareness about it. Was legitimate criticism. The film's acknowledgement of the trope before deploying it didn't neutralize the deployment. Marina Baccarin was reduced from a full co-lead to an afterlife presence, and that reduction served the story's mechanics at the cost of a character who deserved more. The mid-credits correction complicates this assessment without resolving it. Bringing Vanessa back through time travel comedy is a genuine acknowledgement of the debt, but it's also positioned as a joke rather than a narrative repair, which means it doesn't restore what was taken so much as it notes, with some humor, that the taking was noted. The sequel, Deadpool and Wolverine, moved the Vanessa character largely off-screen through the device of her and Wade having separated, which continued rather than reversed the franchise's difficulty in finding an ongoing role for her. This is worth naming clearly, not to dismiss the film but to be accurate about what it achieved and where it fell short. Deadpool 2 is a deeply thoughtful film about grief, abuse, chosen family, and the relationship between humor and pain, and it has a structural blind spot about how it uses its primary female character. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and holding them simultaneously is more useful than either pure praise or pure condemnation. Deadpool 2, in the longer view, 6 years on from its release, sitting in a landscape where its franchise has been absorbed into the world's largest entertainment corporation, and R-rated superhero films have gone from industry anomalies to viable strategic options. Deadpool 2's specific achievement comes into clearer focus. It wasn't the funniest superhero film ever made, though it was extremely funny. It wasn't the most technically innovative, though it was technically excellent. It wasn't the most thematically ambitious superhero film of its era. Logan and Black Panther, both released in the same general period, were operating in different registers of seriousness. What Deadpool 2 was, more precisely than any of those claims, was the most successfully bifurcated. The film that most completely occupied two tonal registers at once, without either one dominating or collapsing the other. That achievement matters because the problem it solved is genuinely hard. Sincerity and irony are not natural cohabitants. Comedy and tragedy don't mix easily at scale. The instinct in commercial filmmaking is always to resolve the tonal tension in one direction or the other. Commit fully to the comedy and let the emotion be texture, or commit fully to the emotion and let the comedy be relief. Deadpool 2 refused that resolution and held both fully realized throughout, and the fact that most audiences received it as entertainment without consciously registering the difficulty of the craft is the highest possible compliment to what it accomplished. Closing. The guy on the gas canister. Go back to where this started. A man on a pile of his own dead bodies, narrating his own death with the specific resignation of someone who's run out of things to try. He's not tragic in the classical sense. He's too self-aware for that, too committed to the joke, too fluent in the language of deflection to ever let you catch him being simply sad. But the deflection is the thing, isn't it? The joke is the tell. You don't work that hard to make death funny unless death is the thing you can't talk about straight. By the end of Deadpool 2, that same man has stepped in front of a bullet for a kid he's known for a few weeks, been pulled back from the precipice by a soldier who spent the film trying to kill him, and found himself in possession of something he didn't plan, didn't recruit, and couldn't have manufactured, people who stayed when they didn't have to. The film doesn't tell you this constitutes healing. Wade still has the jokes, still has the deflection, still has the comedy routine he's built over a lifetime of having nowhere else to put the things that hurt. None of that disappears. What changes, what the film's final act quietly insists has changed, is the relationship between the joke and what it's covering. Before Vanessa's death, the humor was protection. After everything the film puts Wade through, the humor is starting to become something else. Not armor against feeling, but the particular language of a person who has learned to carry both the joke and the weight it's resting on simultaneously. That's not a superhero arc. That's not a redemption narrative, or a hero's journey, or any of the structural templates the genre offers. It's something closer to what actual grief and actual recovery look like when you're paying attention. Not a clean transformation, not a moment of resolution, but a subtle, hard-won shift in how someone relates to their own damage. The wound underneath still exists, but the man walking around on top of it has a slightly different relationship to the gap between the two, and the film trusts you to see that without explaining it. Deadpool 2 is a movie about a man who can't die, told as a movie about why it matters that he keeps choosing not to. It wraps that inside comedy and action and meta-commentary and one of the best ensemble casts a superhero film has assembled, and it delivers all of those things with craft and commitment and a precision of tone that most films in any genre don't manage. But underneath all of it, underneath the choral superhero scoring and the woodchipper and Peter and the juggernaut and Cable's mechanical arm, is one insistent, recurring question that the film never stops asking and never fully answers. What's the smallest possible reason that's still enough to pull someone back from the edge? Deadpool 2's answer, offered through 2 hours of violence and jokes and genuine emotional exposure, is whatever specific person needs you to stay, right now, in this moment, for this particular reason. Not the world, not destiny, not a power greater than yourself. Just Russell, standing in that hallway, needing someone to still be there. And for now, that's enough.